Okay, so I think we'll begin, and I am Hasia Diner from New York University, and I want to welcome you to this session number 4 entitled Recreating Home in the United States. I'm going to refrain from saying anything until after all of the speakers and merely as part of the conversation amongst them and with you. So our first, we're going to slightly changing the, slightly changing the order on your program, and our first speaker, okay, how's that? Is that better? Okay, still closer. How's that? Better? Okay, so whatever I said before was not that important. So our first speaker is Jeffrey Pilcher, who is to my right here, who is professor of history at the University of Minnesota, probably the world's expert on Mexican food in its multiple iterations. Okay, and his paper is entitled Old Stock, in quotes, Tamales and Migrant Tacos, Preserving Traditions in the 19th Century Southwest and Recreating Home in Present Day, and I'm going to let you pronounce the last word.
Manhattitlan, thank you. Academics are notorious for biting the hand that feeds us. And sometimes this is speaking truth to power, to politicians, to capitalists, university presidents maybe. More often, though, it's simply quibbling about the terms, and this paper is definitely in the quibbling category. And so I want to thank the organizers of this conference, Fabio and Ariane, for putting together a wonderful one, but I am going to quibble a little bit with the description of what this particular panel was about, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the title of my talk comes from the language of American nationalism and immigration history. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, old stock came into use in the late 19th century to distinguish the descendants of Anglo-Saxon settlers and Northern European settlers from the new immigrants that were arriving in the late 19th century. And the term really reflected that scientific racism, the racial thought of the time, and derives from earlier meanings of the word referring to lineage or descent. It's actually, this is a lot like livestock breeding, and of course that's the way scientific racists thought at the time, eugenics and the like. And so in 1896, the New York Times spoke of the view taken of the Irish by the old stock American race, right? That the Irish, Southern, and Eastern Europeans were newcomers, that they were not legitimate somehow, and that it was these Northern European Anglo-Saxons, who were the real Americans. And of course, this East Coast usage of old stock ignores earlier settlers, and I'm not talking just about the Native Americans, but also Spaniards who founded towns at Santa Fe, New Mexico, St. Augustine, Florida, prior to the settlements at Jamestown and Plymouth. And in the 19th century, it was the Anglo-Saxons who were the immigrants into the Southwest. And some of them actually were documented immigrants, right? Stephen Austin, Jim Bowie were actually had sworn an oath of allegiance to Mexico and had converted to Catholicism and were legitimate settlers in Texas. And then there were what we might think of as the illegal immigrants in the Southwest, people like Davy Crockett or others. Okay, so I bring this up not just to challenge American nationalist narratives, but also to question some of the assumptions that frame this panel. Okay, so the idea of recreating home of migrant cultures, I think, is one that it sort of follows from what was called the image of transplantation. Okay. And this is unquestionably an improvement over an older sort of paradigm from immigration history, this idea of assimilation, right? That people come and then they become Americans in the melting pot, right? And so transplantation sort of implies that they're able to bring some of their culture with them, okay? And this is clearly an improvement. I think more recent literature in the field is really sort of noticing that there are these international circuits of movement back and forth, right? It's not just a one-way ticket, whether it be through assimilation or through transplantation. And so to sort of illustrate that, I want to give you a couple of images here, right, and just ask the question, which is Mexico? Okay, on the one hand, we have this taco truck, but it turns out that the taco truck is located right here in New York City. On the other side, we have some Mexicans shopping at Walmart, but it's Walmart de Mexico, which is now the biggest supermarket in Mexico, supermarket company. And actually, some of you may have read in the Times about a year ago about how Walmart became the biggest supermarket in Mexico through widespread bribery. But anyway, the point, though, is that, you know, our sort of assumptions about what the migrant cultures were and what the home are is very problematic ones, and ones I want to sort of suggest that we think a little bit about, right? And so when we think about migrant cultures, right? So this is you know, something of a historical problem, because oftentimes there's an assumption that the sending society, the old country, is the historical past, and that, you know, the Americans, when they come here and become immigrants, become here and become American, that then they become active, lively, changing. You know, that's the present. Okay, but you know, this really needs to be balanced with the recognition that those old countries are in fact, you know, changing historically as well, right? People are going shopping at Walmart de Mexico. You know, these are global cultures, and we need to recognize the changes that are happening in places like Mexico. And also there's a geographical problem with this image of migrant cultures, and that is, you know, just where is Mexico? Under a very, very well-known phrasing, there's a statement, many Mexicos, right? So geographically, Mexico is very distinct, and the cuisines of Mexico likewise, okay? And second of all, the question of what exactly is the domestic environment, right? Of course, many of these migrants are unattached males, and so the home that they're creating is going to be very different from the one where they have families within, right? These men are having to assume many of the formerly female activities of homemaking, if you will. And of course, they're doing it under very difficult circumstances in tenement houses where they can't produce some of the same things. And so the home that they're recreating may be in the workplace. Creating communities among fellow workers where they actually spend most of their time, you know, if they're working 12 hours a day, as so many of them are. It may be outside of the home, right? Eating tacos in the street or playing soccer. So we just need to think a little more critically about what these ideas of migrant cultures and of the domestic are. Okay. So in this talk, I want to try to address some of these questions by looking at Mexican food traditions in the Southwest, and I'm going to sort of focus mostly on the past and on contemporary New York. So let me start with the Southwest and sort of think about what's old stock there. And one of the interesting things for me about the sort of formation of Southwestern cuisine and Southwestern culture is that it is, like so much of Mexico, it's a mestizo, a mixture of Spanish and indigenous peoples, okay? But what's particularly interesting about the Southwest is that there actually are multiple indigenous peoples and multiple conquistadors, right? So here are some old stock Americans of the Southwest. And of course, here we have the indigenous, these are Hopi women grinding corn. And here are the conquistadors, okay? The Spaniards who are Coronado, who's going to go up and conquer these pueblos. But then we have this third group over here, okay? And Actually, there's lots of reasons that I put this image up. First of all, I love the little symbols, or the little images on their costume there, right? So we have little Tinkerbell here, and we have this is sort of the symbols of modern day Mexico, right? The sleeping woman and the Aztec god that are part of this sort of these, anyways, Mexican popular culture. But these are actually people from Tlaxcala. And Tlaxcalans were the first allies of Cortez during the conquest. And so as a result, they actually became conquistadors. And when the Spaniards moved into northern Mexico, what's now the Southwest, they enlisted these native conquistadors to help them with the process. And so you actually have now a mixing in the Southwest of 3 different cultures, right? Of the indigenous people who were living there, the indigenous people who came as conquistadors, and then Spanish culture. And so the foods there are a particularly interesting mix, okay? So what are some of these foods? Well, tamales, of course, but carne asada. Okay, so here we have a classic indigenous Mesoamerican food, but here we have a Western, right? Because carne asada, you know, is the cattle were imported by the Spaniards, okay? And this actually, I sort of put this up to represent California, sort of to give you a sense of the regional cuisines that had developed within the Southwest. And then the carne asada represents sort of Arizona, Sonora, this cattle country there. Here we have actually chili verde, right, which is a classic New Mexico dish using the New Mexico green chili, which itself is an interesting mix, because before the Spaniards came, chili peppers were not present among the Pueblos. These were actually imported by Franciscans, and this distinctive New Mexico chili is a creation of the colonial era. And then finally we have cabrito, or goat, which is the classic Tex-Mex dish before chili, or it's all very complicated, and I have to say I'm simplifying here quite a bit. But the point is that in the Southwest, among these sort of what becomes these Mexican American cultures, there's an enormous amount of distinctiveness. Okay, so how then did these colonial Hispanic, Mexican, whatever you want to call them, cuisines of the Southwest come to be Tex-Mex? Okay, and this, of course, happened in the 19th century when Anglo-Saxon immigrants came in and conquered the Southwest, and really came to imagine Mexican food as being this exotic but dangerous thing. And it became associated with a group of women in particular known as the Chili Queens of San Antonio. Okay, and these were just ordinary street vendors. I mean, that's all they were. They're enclosed here under. It's actually one of the periodic sweeps of you know, trying to improve the sanitation. Right, you know, they had to be enclosed, and I mean, this is sort of reminiscent of many of the same things that we see, you know, with health campaigns among immigrant vendors today, and it's been going on for 100 years. But anyway, these chili queens, and as here, I mean, we see they're just, you know, nice Mexican-American women. There's nothing particularly exotic about them, but they were imagined by these Anglo-Saxons as being these flirtatious Spanish women who, you know, they were dangerous because they served this chili, which, you know, was hot and unaccustomed, you know, to what the you know, these Anglo-Saxons, you know, with their bland white sauce. So there was a gastronomic danger from eating something with spice in it, chili. But there was also a sexual danger that was imagined among these chili queens, right? That they would flirt with the young men and lure them off into some sort of a racial disaster, right? You know, contamination, right? So there was this sort of contamination from the chili, but then the racial contamination as well, right? So that's sort of image. And to this day, I think we still have this image of Chili Queen still is very pervasive among what people think about Mexican food, and that these stereotypes that were established in this colonial era are very enduring, right? This image of Mexico as being transgressive and yet appealing, dangerous and yet, well, the hot tamale, if you will, right? And of course, at the same time, it's being industrialized and sold on a mass market by, not people outside the Mexican community, right? And so, anyway, so here we have these stereotypes being created, but I don't want this image of the Southwest to just stay in the historical past, and I want to talk very briefly about contemporary New Mexico traditions and actually what's happened today with tourism. I happened to be for a conference in Santa Fe right after Holy Week, and went up to Chimayo, which is this sort of legendary culinary tourism site, and here are some of the dishes you have in New Mexico among these communities, and there are things like chicos, little corn things, the torta de huevo. This actually, in most Lenten dishes in Mexico, it would be torta de camarón, dried shrimp, little patties. But in Chimayo, they were so poor they couldn't even afford the dried shrimp, and so they just made the little. Actually, they mix it with some red chili sauce. It's sort of like having a souffle with a little red chili on top. Here's panocha, which is it's actually a sprouted wheat pudding. It's actually sort of like starting to make beer, but then turning it into dessert. And then finally, just so it doesn't again seem like it's all traditional and old, here's the Chimayo hot dog. Okay, so these are changing historically. So anyway, so these are some of the traditions, and what's happened though is that as tourists have started crowding to places like Chimayo, the people are actually being pushed out of the temple, the santuario, the church, and kind of having to do their own little affairs at home. Okay, so there you have the old, right, the traditions, the settler traditions of the Southwest, and now let's shift to migrant tacos. Okay, the new. And actually, unfortunately, I don't really have time to sort of give you the whole history of the taco, but let me just say it's actually amazingly recent that tacos do not go back to the ancient Aztecs, okay? And that tacos are developing in the United States at the same time as they are in Mexico. So this opposition, sort of this McDonaldization theory, right, where we take peasant cuisines and we make them efficient and modern, doesn't apply in the case of Taco Bell. That the Mexican taco is itself a product of modernity, just like the Mexican-American one, and that immigrants to Mexico are transforming it. So everyone, well, maybe some of you have had tacos al pastor, which looks a lot like shawarma. Because it is, frankly. It was actually Lebanese migrants who brought it to Mexico. And it was second-generation Lebanese Mexicans who turned it into tacos al pastor in the 1960s, right? This is how old these Mexican traditional foods are, okay? And here are some Mexican migrants, and doing the kinds of jobs that they're doing here, right? Working in kitchens, working in agriculture, domestic workers, selling tacos, and organizing, as we've seen in today. And also I want to emphasize, sort of the diversity of this community, right? It's really a mix of working class, but also elite, right? There's this Manhatitlan, right? Which is actually, Tenochtitlan was the Aztec capital. And as a lot of Mexican intellectuals, restaurant owners and whatnot have moved here, they've sort of created this alternate version, or not an alternate version, but a more diverse Mexican society, right? So you've got mariachis playing in the subway, you've got community organizations, you've got the Virgin of Guadalupe, but then you've also got this incredible upscale cuisine taking place with Mexican chefs, like Roberto Santibáñez, like Zarela Martinez, right? And this is actually the original tableside, sort of like the Caesar salad, which incidentally is a Mexican food as well. an Italian immigrant to Tijuana, actually, invented the Caesar salad. And now they're making Caesar salad style things with guacamole at Rosa Mexicano. And so you've got this upscale thing. And actually, one of the interesting things for me about this upscale Nueva Cocina Mexicana is that it's actually a transnational product of chefs in the United States, in Mexico, working simultaneously. Okay? But for me, one of the most interesting things about this process is the class dynamic of it. Because in many, many cases, even the upscale versions of this are portrayed as street food, right? So we have places like pulqueria. We have paletas, right? These popular culture things, which are, all the fad, And then we have my favorite, tacumbi. Has anybody been here? Don't remember. Actually, I got taken over there. I don't remember exactly. Somewhere in the village, you can find it. And you can order your tacos from a Volkswagen Kumbi, as it's called. So anyway. So just a complex world of sort of food being created here. And so just very quickly by way of conclusion, how long does a food have to be here for it to be old stock? Right, is it the food? Is it really about the food itself, or is it about the people? Are we talking about race here, or are we talking about And I think the answer to this is in part derives from sort of the sensory studies that we can start to by thinking about how we smell and taste. Analytically, that will help us to decide, the ways in which sort of racism as a perceived view of others and the physical experience can help us to understand, how food contributes to status in our society, right? How does food create home? And I think here we're looking at memory. We're also looking at authenticity. And I think Krishnendu did a magnificent job of really talking about some of the problems involved in looking at authenticity. And all I would say about that is that, authenticity is really a hopeless endeavor. Okay, just like it's not Krishnendu's mother's cooking, right? If we're looking for some timeless past, it's always changing, right? There's no way of, and of course, we're looking for this authenticity as a form of novelty anyway. So anyway, I guess my most hopeful conclusion would be about the ways, the sort of what the process of becoming a food and contributing to the process of ethnicity, right? Because one of the really interesting phenomenons is the way that the taco is now used by new immigrants, think Korean tacos, to Americanize their foods, right? And so I think it's wonderful that, that these new immigrants can help us to think in new ways about what it means in America to be old stock. So thank you.
Thank you so much for staying in the time, so I didn't have to use my please wrap up card here. So our second speaker, who's going to be providing more of an overview presentation, is Fabio Parasecoli. How did I do on pronunciation?
Yep.
Okay. And he is Associate Professor and Coordinator of Food Studies here at the New School, and is involved in food studies both here and in Italy and in Spain, and sort of truly a global scholar.
Thank you, and thanks again for coming and making this event quite extraordinary. We did what we could to get a great lineup of panelists, but the discussions are just coming out of you, and these are making this conference special. Anyway, so actually I'm gonna sort of talk about the same issues that Jeffrey talked about, but I'm looking at them more from the communication and political sciences point of view, which is more of my background. And I would start from the concept of authenticity because I'm an immigrant myself and I'm Italian. So people have certain expectations of what I eat, what I cook, and what I consider good and what I consider bad. So it's been very interesting inviting them to my place and cook, and they look at me like, this is not Italian food. And oh, okay. And I realized, that, again, what's the idea of Italy that they have? Probably it's not my experience back in Rome. So there is always a problem here. And for me, authenticity, as we talked today, it's, about context, it's about perceptions, but I think also, for me, what's relevant is why are we talking about authenticity? Why has it become a relevant concept in the discourse about food? Why are we looking for authenticity? And how do we use, different cultural elements as such? So I would start also from one personal experience, my first American meal. When I moved here in 1998, I was invited by my grandmother's sister, who had moved here in the 30s. And she gathered the whole family, like 60 people, aunts, cousins that I had never seen in my life. And they organized this fantastic meal, huge amount of food that they were presenting to me like, we want you to feel at home. And I couldn't make sense of what was on the table, which was sort of interesting. It was great food, tasty, and the family was there, the way we spoke, the body language, the noise, all those things were there. But for instance, I didn't know how to deal with this, because I came from a place where, we organize dishes in courses, and we have pasta, which is a first course, and then we have meat, which is a second course. And here I was presented this dish that had the two together. And, I had never been exposed to American foodways, and I was sort of thinking, how should I attack this? Should I eat the meatball first, but then the pasta comes second? It was interesting. Of course, this first experience has turned into, a larger reflection, and I've been teaching classes on food and migrations here at the New School. And some of my reflection today actually come out of the work I've done with students. I had them map neighborhoods. I had them look precisely the transnational networks that Jeffrey was mentioning. So how does food and migration and migrants and their identity work? So I will start from from a simple fact. Again, I come from communication in a way. So food, for me, it's something that can also be read in a way as an ensemble of texts. So every ingredient, every single dish, the way meals are organized, and all the other elements that form a specific culinary culture are mutually connected. They are influenced not only by the past, frequently interpreted and practiced as tradition. And for me, it's very important that tradition is something that we do and we practice. It's not actually a reflection of the past. It's what we make of it. So the dishes are also influenced by new occurrences resulting from both internal dynamics among the migrants and the absorption and elaboration of external elements. As a result, meanings attributed to food are never completely fixed and defined once and for all, but are always continually negotiated and transformed through practices, discourse, and representations. However, despite constant changes, food cultures do have a certain internal coherence, to the point that individuals and communities that identify with them feel entitled to determine if specific food-related behaviors and objects are acceptable or deviant within their parameters. Again, my American friends questioning my Italian food. So we have this sort of internal, this culinary competence. The concept originates in linguistics, and it refers to the ability to perceive phenomena in our environment as signs. That is to say, to understand the connection between present, partially hidden, and entirely absent elements. So the concept seems, for me, to maintain its analytical validity when applied to food, as users are able to make sense of what they eat, at least when they stay within the realm of the familiar. culinary competence goes beyond the production of meanings, discourses, and representations connected to food, as it also functions as a practical toolkit acquired through embodied experiences and behaviors directed towards concrete goals. One element that came out from our conversation is that we are talking about individuals, actually living bodies. What does it mean when these bodies become part of these transnational networks, connections? And that's the political part of it. In political science, there is a lot of reflection about these contemporary networks, the non-places, supermodernity. Well, it's all about bodies. What happens with physical persons, with emotions and sensations, get caught into all this. So the question, though, is that the cohesion, this culinary competence, it's far less binding compared to a linguistic system. So we can describe it as a thin coherence. Although individuals and communities are able to engage in effective interactions, the meaning and behaviors they produce can never be totally stable, revealing themselves as variable, contested, ever-changing, and incomplete. So I propose to explore how migrants develop these competences together with the meanings, experience, and memories that constitute them through 4 conceptually distinct but offer overlapping categories: personal, communal, collective, and institutional. And I developed these categories actually working with students on their research, because they were coming back with interviews, with work over the internet, forums on the internet. They were mapping neighborhoods, and it seems that the phenomenological experience, the way people experience the food, could come down to these 4 categories. Of course, no single categories has priority in terms of time, space, or relevance, as most experiences may present more than one or all the undertones highlighted by each aspect. This approach responds to the difficulty of identifying singular and essential identities, both for individual subjects and larger groups. The idea is that multiple subject and social positions may be experienced and performed dealing with different situations and environment. So when you look at the actual experience, you have to go beyond the fact of looking at essence, which means what's authentic. But how are these people living their experiences? How are they perceiving them? So I would start from the personal level, that it's the most immediate and idiosyncratic. Individuals find themselves at the juncture between necessity, the inputs from the outside world, and the inner worlds of drives and instincts. The senses and memories are increasingly interpreted as faculties that do not limit themselves to mirror nature, more or less precisely. And this is something very important. Here we have an element that it's a reflection that is being developed in memory studies and in neuroscience, so both in the humanities, social sciences, and in more scientific endeavors. So the concept is that memories do not mirror nature more or less precisely. So what's outside? According to the research in neurosciences, their contents are rather the result of ongoing dynamic interactions between external stimuli and the various emotional and rational activity of the brain. Memories are not fixed once and for all, ready to be accessed when needed. And this is the concept of the file cabinet and the computer. Now we think of ourselves in terms of, a memory. So we have our memories, we file it, and it stays there. Then when we need it, we open the cabinet, get the file, and we find the memory as it is, as it was when we put it there. This is what happens with computers. Neuroscientists are really working and proving that for us, for our brain, it doesn't work like that at all. So as a matter of fact, memories change, both in the moment when you create them, depending on your physical state, your emotional state, the overall situation, but they also change when you retrieve them, depending again on your emotional state, the situation of your body. So you realize that this makes even the concept of memory, tradition, authenticity quite more complicated if we look at from this point of view. So when migrants find themselves in unfamiliar sensory and cultural environments, eating is an inevitable component of daily life that forces them to interact physically, emotionally, and cognitively with the surrounding otherness, with a big O. When it comes to ingestion, the embodied contact is intimate to the point of becoming at times uncomfortable or even invasive, because the positions of the parties involved are fundamentally different in terms of socio-political power, cultural capital, and sheer economic clout. We can never take these equations out of politics and power relationships. We need to keep it there because it really influences the way even personal memories are created. So people that are exposed to new foods experience, what's called neophilia and neophobia, and I skip on this. The paper will be published, and by the way, please get the journal when it comes out. You can book it in advance. A little marketing doesn't hurt. What's neophilia and neophobia? Neophilia is the fact that people are always looking for new sources of food, new sources of energy, and nutrition. Neophobia is the awareness that the new food can actually be dangerous or even poisonous. So when you're exposed to new foods, there can be this tension. And there is Claude Fischler, a French scholar, that wrote extensively about this. So the second level is communal experiences. And here I refer to family, neighborhoods, friends. So experiences and memories that are built by interaction in which the subject is directly involved. So here we have a few experiences. I put the image of the tomato sauce making in summer. That's something, for instance, is very present in my mind. When I was a child, I would work in these things, all day preparing tomato sauce for the winter. And it became a family tradition. We had specific ways to do it, specific foods that we would eat on those occasions. We would invite friends and family to help us. That would become a party, and so on. And there are tons of these traditions. For instance, sausage making around Christmas in certain parts of the Italian-American community, and so on. But what's important here is that there are experiences that are lived through direct connections with people that are close to each other. And these are important when you find yourself in a new place. This is an example of a communal meal of Zimbabwe African People's Union in Canada. So in a way, they try to bring that experience to the new place. As Jeffrey pointed out, though, what's their experience in their place of origin in the first place? And then we have the other level of collective practices, when suddenly, over time, there is the development of traditions or practices that maybe do not really connect with the place of origin. So for instance, in the case of the Italian-American community, I discovered that there is this 7-fish meal for Christmas that we don't have in Italy. So how did that develop over time? And what's the meaning of that situation? And the same thing is the development of big occasions like a Seder for Easter or a New Year's Eve meal for the Chinese community. And I'll skip to the fourth level, which I think is becoming more and more relevant: institutionalized memories and experiences. So in the past, maybe 20 years, there is also an intervention of public offices, governments, different institutions that in a way define what traditions, what certain foods are supposed to be. A perfect example is the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage of Humanity list, in which the gastronomic meal of the French, the Mediterranean diet, and the traditional Mexican cuisine, ancestral and ongoing community culture, the Michoacan paradigm, were added. So what it means when UNESCO defines what the gastronomic meal is. Who defines it? And here we go back to the politics. Who has the authority to decide what's the meal and what's not the meal? Who's left outside this conversation? and what happens when there is a supposedly scientifically sound description of a tradition. What happens to traditions that do not mirror that official description? This happens not only for practices, but also for specific foods. Here we have the symbols of the EU products, protected designation of origin, and so on, geographical indications that define what a food should be like, what should taste like, how it should be made, how long it should age, and so on and so forth. So I think looking at these four different aspects of migrant experiences can help us get an idea that is closer to the point of view of the migrant. And maybe we could read that also in terms of what it means to create community around food and what's the role of community when you're in a new place that you're not familiar with. Thank you.
So let me introduce our next speaker, who is Dwayne Plaza, who is here from the Department of Sociology in the School of Public Policy at Oregon State University. He works, among other topics, on the food of the Trinidadian diaspora in Canada and the United States, and is very much in the sort of forefront of studies of the Caribbean world and its migration outward. So.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this session, and I also want to thank formally Fabio and Ariane for inviting me to this very prestigious conference, and I also like to thank Roberta for all the things that she's done in the background to make all this stuff work, and being patient with me when I'm making travel arrangements and all the rest of that kind of thing. So I'm sure many of our folks who traveled here were appreciative of Roberta's role. What I'm going to try and present to you today is something I'm fairly passionate about, and that is the whole idea of how food is constructed in the Caribbean community, more specifically the Trinidadian community. Before I do begin, though, I worked on this research with an undergraduate student in my school. You can well imagine, coming from a school of public policy, there are not many graduate students who want to do this kind of research, so I had to go down to an undergraduate level and recruit from there in my sociology department, but he was a great help on this research. So this is a joint research project based on mixed methods. What I want to do then is to actually find out from you folks, before I begin, how many people here have actually know what a roti and or doubles are? Okay, good. How many people here have actually tasted roti and doubles? Okay, we're getting to less and less. How many people like roti and doubles? All right, good. All right. So as I'm speaking here then, I'm going to, for the benefit of those folks who've never understood what roti and doubles are, I'm going to try and play a quick video clip here. And let's see if this works. Hopefully the sound is up. The sound man up there has got me covered.
Now we are standing at Mom's Roti. Is known to be the best roti here on St. James. So I'm going to try vegetable roti and see what I think. Apparently she took the roti and threw all the mixed vegetables and things like that inside it, kind of wrapped it like a burrito, and I guess you just dig in.
You want any?
One? Slight. So tell me what it is.
Well, this is basically,
Yeah.
it's made out of flour, right?
Yeah.
And this is chickpeas, right?
Yeah.
And why they call it doubles, it consists of two. One is single, two is double.
Yeah.
And then there's various sauces. This is hot sauce. This is sweet. And this is like a salad,
Nice.
right?
Yeah.
That is it. That's a double.
Nice. Thank you.
So now we're on the same page of what a doubles and what a roti is. So hopefully you'll get a chance to here in New York City, which has a lot of places for doubles and roti, especially if you go down to Flatbush area. Again, where I come from, there are no roti and doubles stores in Corvallis, Oregon, as you can well imagine. So when I come here, I'm in heaven. Or if I go home to Toronto, I was born in Trinidad, migrated to Canada in 1968, and grew up in Toronto, but took a job out on the West Coast 18 years ago. So it's been a long time going back and forth, carrying rotis in my suitcase, carrying rotis, skins so they sit in the fridge, all those sort of things one does when one lives in the periphery to try to satisfy one's taste. Let me begin this presentation by reading this quote. Roti and doubles not only satisfies the palate of and hunger, but it takes us back to our roots and homeland. All of a sudden, memories and images flood our minds and hearts, and the feeling is euphoric. Eating Caribbean food gives me a comforting feeling as it reminds me of home and family times. It takes me back to my roots, how far away I am from that, and it's saddening. What I'm going to do from now on is provide you with quantitative data based on a study which we conducted online using social media. And I'm also going to provide for you from now on some qualitative data to back up some of the trends that were going on in our data, in our study, I should say. My question is, many Caribbean immigrants living away from their home and countries directly correlate specific foods with specific good times. And food, in many respects, plays a large part in many aspects of Trinidadian culture. It becomes fundamentally associated with the positive memories, never the negative, social and familial relationships and locations of cultural importance. And roti and doubles, in this particular study, are particular cultural foods used by Trinidadians to define and maintain specific boundaries of identification, while simultaneously highlighting those boundaries that are permeable and are full of ambivalence for belonging. And so what I'm going to do in this paper is I'm going to use roti and doubles and look at them as comfort foods for Trinidadians, which gives them a psychological feeling of being back home. And regular consumption of either home-bought or homemade or store-bought roti and doubles gives Trinidadian immigrants a replacement for the object loss. And I'm going to talk about my theoretical framework in the next couple slides, but ultimately this idea of object loss really helps Trinidadians give a feeling of complacency. It replaces the mourning that they often go through of missing back home. And oftentimes roti and doubles becomes associated with those significant positive memories, and it serves as a connection to their heritage and can equally be used to demonstrate through the culture over time. And oftentimes this begins as a really early part of their socialization, and they often perceive this as a sense of home, a really good feeling. So the theoretical framework that informs this particular paper is based on a number of theorists in the area of immigration research. And ultimately, I'm going to summarize this in the sense that what we know about immigrants is they don't lose touch with home, typically. They stay in touch through becoming involved in things like political movements, community organizations, church groups. And often we've referred to this, and many of the speakers before me, and I'm not going to go into this, of course, is this transnational connection. And this transnational connection is simultaneously back and forth in the sense, and it can include things like food, music, dances, festivals, popular artists that come up and do concerts and so forth. And these really contribute to the immigrants' sense of well-being, sense of mattering as they go through life and deal with issues of oftentimes institutionalized and systemic racism and discrimination in societies where they now live. And so this sense of cultural mourning really comes from the theories of object loss postulated by Sigmund Freud. The idea when people actually lose something, they try to put it back in place. And so food then becomes that bridge that creates that gap between what people feel they've lost, the object loss, and that sense of feeling that what they desire to have. And so they often engage in activities like consuming food, attending like a soca party or a reggae dance in order for them to recreate or restore that feeling of what was lost previously. And so the linking object, whatever that object is, and in my case I'm using food as that linking object, becomes that symbolic bridge that reconciles that feeling of grief that people may have in terms of feeling of alienation, feeling of distancing because of racism and so forth. And so again, this becomes the symbolic putting back what people have actually felt that they've lost. And so what does it mean then for groups like Trinidadians, for example, to recreate their cultural situation from a cultural meaning from when they're now living in these sites of alienation? And so, in my opinion, and in many of the other researchers who've done much more research on this than I ever have, the whole anthropological schools that have done leading edge research, they've suggested to us that home comes to be understood as a place where people are not only emotionally connected, but they can also be physically connected over time. And these social boundaries are going back and forth. So now to talk about this research. Taylor and I were involved in this research in terms of collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. And we constructed a non-random electronic survey using a piece of software called Qualtrics. And ultimately, the survey consisted of 21 questions. The first 10, of course, were your typical demographic background questions. The next set of questions, however, really put a focus on the idea of roti and doubles. And I'd like to try and show you what the survey looked like if I can get some cooperation here from the computer. Let's see if it works. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Yes, it's going to cooperate. So the survey looked like this. It went out as an electronic link to friends, family, networks, and it was asked a barrage of demographic questions on the front end, and then went into some great detail on consumption and eating patterns. So we can see that we sent out the survey beyond the Trinidadian community. We're trying to cast a wide net so that other papers are possible out of this particular data set eventually. But for this particular presentation, I'm going to be focusing on doubles and roti, and I will talk about those and how they are, what the outcomes were. The qualitative aspect of the study was it was very interesting also. What we did for that is we used the Google search, and we went online and used just the word roti shops, and plugged that into Google, and lo and behold, over 900,000 hits were made. And so these were hits across the board. So we went into the hits and started pulling up just places that were roti shops that actually had photographs on them, if they had a website, and if the website was actually active. And what we did is we did a content analysis of those. And what I want to do now is just walk through some of these with you, just to point out some of the patterns which we started seeing. So when you go to your typical roti shop now in the entire diaspora, these are spaces and places that include Toronto, New York, of course, all across the eastern seaboard, even places as far as Australia. You start to see some really interesting patterns. Some of the patterns include things like very well-placed flags. Oftentimes, the shops are set up virtually almost the same when you walk into them, with spices on the front and other objects being sold. You often saw palm trees. You often saw the entire menu on the front or some kind of major special. You often saw also many of the shops would be painted on the inside in very Caribbean-like colors, in other words, pastel colors and so forth. And what was really interesting is that these patterns kept repeating themselves over time. Even if you're in Trinidad, the authentic store was recreated in Toronto, or even as far as when you go to Great Britain, you'd see the same thing. Even though it's a trailer, they still, on the inside of this trailer, you could start seeing all the reminiscence of home. And finally, the last ones here I'll show you. Again, you can see flags. You can see, again, the idea of authenticity. When you go inside, it reminds you about being back home. Often, many of these also had some of these patterns here. And so when we did our content analysis of the 80 restaurants, we saw that most of them, of course, had the name roti in the actual name of the restaurant. Less so actually had the word doubles. And as we did further investigation, we started to realize that doubles is actually a street food. And so most restaurants wouldn't actually use that unless they're outside in the diaspora somewhere. We also noted that the word Trinidad or Guyana was often not necessarily in the name of the restaurant itself. Was in the name of the restaurant itself. And we often found that Caribbean color schemes were used. Palm trees were always, or beach scenes were oftentimes part of the way in which people would name or advertise their stores. And images of food and or Caribbean flags. So you can see here by these patterns, we're really starting to realize that when people construct their stores, they try to create a space or a location where people feel comfortable. People feel a sense of being back home for the time you're there to either order or the time you're there to order and eat. Let me now provide you some background on the demographic characteristics of the people who we actually did survey. And as I mentioned, we actually had a large sample of 222 respondents to our survey, but not all of them were from Trinidad. So we only selected out the 116 who were Trinidadians. And so what I'm going to report on next is the outcomes of that particular population. So of our total 116, we had, which is typical in survey research, you have many more women than men participating. The oldest person was 76, the youngest was 18, and the average age was 45. When you looked at how people self-identified, I thought that was a really interesting variable because we found that a lot of women tended to identify as mixed, whereas men didn't necessarily identify in that same way, which is very interesting. And we found that, of course, the breakdown was a heavier skew of Indo-Caribbean men actually reporting, and again, we couldn't explain that. This population was heavily skewed towards people with university or higher university level education. Also interesting from this population is that many of them were reporting that they do a lot of transnational back and forth. In other words, they visit home quite a bit. And then finally, in terms of experiencing discrimination, again, we found that a significant number of people from our survey reported experiencing discrimination in their experiences living abroad. So it's very interesting. Oh, sorry, I thought you were looking at something. We can go back to it in the questions. So one of the key questions taken off the survey we wanted to find out about is, when you eat doubles, what are your most significant feelings? And we see here, doubles makes me feel like I'm back home. So this idea of home really starts to come out for a lot of people as they construct why they're eating, when they're eating this particular thing, what it actually makes them feel like. And also doubles puts me in a good mood, which is, again, very interesting. So some of this is linking back now to the literature which we reviewed, and it really suggests to us that there's a real connection between the existing literature on immigration and eating these two particular foods. When you eat a roti, what are the most significant feelings you have? And this is also very interesting. Again, home comes out to be very significant, being put in a good mood when they eat it. And also, of course, other things like getting a warm feeling inside, and also makes people feel happier, which is very, very interesting about eating a particular food. When you eat doubles, what are your memories of home? And once again, nostalgia, feeling of loss, object loss, and so forth seems to come out here quite clearly. I think a lot about missing home. I think a lot about my Caribbean identity. These seem to be quite predominant, and I think a lot about the pleasant taste of curry on my tongue. Got it, thank you. When you eat a roti, what are your memories of home? And what's very interesting about this, what seems to come out all the time, is this idea of mother. And mothers and homes and kitchens, Fabio talks about it a lot. You also hear about it in literature. Mom's kitchen always seems to be the location that people reconnect with in terms of pleasant memories. It's rarely ever someone talks about a bad memory in their household back home, which is, and we all know that people had bad memories, but they just don't talk about them, of course, right? And maybe mom couldn't cook, but she's still venerated. I think about missing home, and I think about my Caribbean identity. So these are really interesting findings that are really connecting back to what we started talking about in the literature review. And again, I'll just read part of this quote. This was part of the data which we collected also, was a whole qualitative side where we asked people to tell us a little bit more about what they feel like when they eat these particular things. Eating doubles makes me happier. It puts me in an optimistic, upbeat state of mind, and it gives me a warm feeling inside. Eating Caribbean food heightens my sense of identity and reminds me of past experiences. And so Carl goes on to talk about all the aspects of his life that he really reconnects with his food situation, and he really tells us a great deal about the way in which his desire to return home is also connected into the foods that he actually consumes. The final quote I'll talk about today is one by Ravi, and again, he is talking a little bit about roti, and he's saying, roti especially is quite sacred. It's a sort of private affair that I love to eat alone in the privacy of my home, where I can create a myth about not being in a Canadian space. Doubles has lost a lot of its appeal, as I know it's a street food, and this is disallowed in Canada. I wait until I return to Trinidad to eat doubles in public. It has a performance aspect to it that establishes as an authentic taste. I return home throughout eating Caribbean food. It brings me back good childhood memories, like eating with my family, and also reminds me of my neighborhood, especially people eating doubles by a double stand. It gives me a sense of community. So to conclude then, what we've tried to put together here is multiple methods to study roti and doubles. And what we clearly see here is that roti and doubles can have both a physical and emotional reminder of a time, place, people, or it connects Trinidadians in the international diaspora to back home. Roti and doubles also serves to summon collective memories for the respondents' identities, which further reinforce the comforting and belonging within a situation otherwise fraught with tension and transition. And roti and doubles also serves to ease the difficulty and stress associated with migration and life changes. And then finally, this case study approach for studying food as a source of comfort and identity for Trinidadians is really exploratory and cannot be necessarily generalized because the sample size is fairly small. What's important about this research is that it begins to reveal how Trinidadian immigrants in the diaspora with food such as roti becomes a way to maintain a sense of normalcy and familiarity with the new land. For descendants, for their descendants, it's a symbol of ethnicity and functions as a connection to their heritage and past. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Young Chen, who is Associate Professor of History and Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine, author of Chinese San Francisco, 1850 to 1943, and I predict in a not such a long time from now will be associated as the preeminent historian of Chinese food in America.
This has been an intellectually yummy and gastronomically stimulating conference for me. So for that, I would like to thank Fabio and Arian for inviting me, for letting me be a part of it. The presentation that you're going to hear next is based on part of a chapter of a book manuscript that I just finished on the rise of Chinese food in the U.S. And because I have only 20 minutes, so let me go right to the essence of the talk, that is the thesis of the talk in the very beginning. So the thesis is that the topic is on Chinese food cookbooks published in the US. And most of these cookbooks were written by Chinese Americans, especially Chinese American women. And they represented an effort to recreate a sense of home in a society that remained very hostile to the China and Chinese culture for many decades. So that's the essence of my talk, the thesis. What I'm going to do is to try to unwrap that thesis in 3 steps. Right. First, I'm going to talk about why it is important to take a look at Chinese food cookbooks published in the U.S. Second, well, in 2 steps. First, I want to talk about the importance of the topic. Second, I want to talk about the ways the Chinese American food cookbook authors used the opportunity not only to promote food, but also to articulate what means, when we say Chinese food, what that means, right? But also to define their identity and to carve out a space for them in the U.S. So a 2-part presentation. But before I start, I would like to ask you a question. How many of you are regular, active cookbook readers? Raise your hand. On a daily basis, I'm sure. Where's the most likely place where you read a cookbook? In the kitchen or somewhere else? Thank you. In fact, cookbooks are fast becoming one of the most important bedtime readings for Americans. Right, so that brings me, can I take this off? Oh, that brings me to the first reason why Chinese food cookbook is important. I'm short because I had to lean over to the microphone. So the first reason why the topic is important is the fact that cookbooks are more than just kitchen menus for cooking. It is common sense that they represent very important and very fascinating historical, social documents. Everyone knows about that. What is interesting here is that there's no correlation between cooking, the activity of cooking on the one hand, and the reading of a cookbook on the other, right? So this is shown in the fact that in the past few decades, while the volume of cookbook sales skyrocketed, the activity of cooking in the home kitchen decreased significantly. In fact, the numbers you can read that I have on the board. The U.S. is the world's most important, the largest market for cookbooks, and we also know at the same time that Americans cook the least, right? Less than people in most other countries, right? So there's no correlation between those two activities. And that's the first reason why it's so important, so fascinating to read a cookbook. For the few of you who haven't read a cookbook, there are people who haven't read a cookbook, it's time to think about it, okay? Please do so seriously. The second reason why Chinese food cookbooks are important, okay, is because of the fact that there are so many that came out of the U.S. Publishers from 1911 to 1985. More than 280 Chinese food cookbooks were published. I'm not counting different editions or printings, right? Just the first time publication of a cookbook, right? There were more than 280 Chinese cookbooks, Chinese food cookbooks that came out in the U.S. What is also interesting is the wide participation in the writing of Chinese food cookbooks, right? Besides Chinese Americans, which will be the focus of my talk, right? You also have people like the Nobel Prize winner Pearl Buck, right? You have the food giant, people like the food giant James Beard. The participation of people like this in the writing of Chinese food cookbooks, right? So which makes the phenomenon even more noticeable and exciting. The third reason why this topic is important, it is simply because few have studied this very important, very extensive phenomenon, right? So on the board, you can see just the few examples that we can find of those who have studied, who have paid serious attention to the topic of Chinese food cookbook publication in the U.S. And the list is not that extensive, right? So this is why I'm here to try to give it a try to talk about how to read a Chinese food cookbook. And I'm still learning how to do that. Okay. The first comment that I want to make is that, first of all, the main point that I would like to make in the second segment of my presentation is that in promoting Chinese food, Chinese American food writers attempted to carve out a space in American culture for themselves as individuals, but also for the Chinese American community. So that's the main argument I want to make in the second segment of my talk. Right, so first, let's take a look at the fact that cookbooks are a very important part of the rise of Chinese food in the realm of public consumption in the U.S. Okay, the rise of Chinese food is a very, very important phenomenon, especially for Chinese Americans, because it provided a crucial livelihood, a lifeline for them. Because in the U.S., cooking, restaurant work was one of the two main occupations that they could have until the 1970s. The other one being the restaurant, the laundry work. Okay, so so like the restaurants, Chinese cookbooks represented another important and conscious effort by Chinese Americans to promote their food. What is interesting is that there are several noticeable differences between the cookbooks on the one hand and the restaurant on the other, right? So the differences are very clearly mapped out in this chart, right? So the cookbooks, they started later than the restaurants, which began to become popular in the late 1880s. And then the motivations also are different. One being mainly economic, and the other being primarily cultural and social. Restaurants are traditionally available only in urban spaces. by comparison, cookbooks promised to bring Chinese food to the private spaces of Americans and also to remote areas without access to Chinese restaurants, right? As a vehicle to introduce knowledge about Chinese food, the function of the restaurants is more limited than cookbooks, which have more autonomy in what they want to talk about. Okay, because owners and operators of restaurants often they have to listen, they have to cater to the preferences of the customers, especially repeated customers. Right? You can't try new things. Right? You have to give them what they want. But in writing a cookbook, they can talk about whatever they want, basically. Not just the food, but also history, tradition, culture, family, and so on and so forth. Okay. Finally, cookbook writing is dominated by women. Right? This is something that we have also seen in many other contexts in this conference so far. Right? But what is interesting about the restaurant is that it was dominated by men. By men. The Chinese American population for a long time in America in the 19th century, early 20th century, was feminized. They were seen as being female, performing female duties also at the same time, right? And women within the Chinese American community in the early decades were not allowed, or at least were not encouraged, to go to a restaurant. Okay, so that also helped to make the restaurant a male-dominated space. Male-dominated space. Okay, most Chinese American most Chinese food cookbooks were authored by Chinese Americans, as I mentioned before. So here you have the number of Chinese American authored cookbooks, and those authored by non-Chinese Americans. Okay. Chinese food writing represented also a cultural dialogue in American society. Okay, so first, you see a tremendous amount of influence from China, from Chinese culture, as a source of inspiration, as a source of authority, right? By the way, Yuan Mei has been probably one of the best known ancient Chinese food writers among Americans. So this is the cookbook that he published in 1792. I can spend the next hour just talking about the fascinating experiences he had in collecting, tasting food while traveling to many different parts of the country. But I will talk about that in my book that I hope will come out very soon. American influence, right? If the Chinese tradition provided the inspiration, American cookbook writing, Anglo cookbook writing, provided the conventions, right? It is those conventions that were followed by Chinese food cookbook writers. Right? This is because, first of all, before the appearance of the first Chinese food cookbook in America, right, there was a translation into Chinese of Western recipes, Western cookbooks. It's a compilation of Western recipes into Chinese, right? Making available knowledge about how to write, how to compose recipes. And the first Chinese food cookbook in America was written not by a Chinese, but by a white person. This is the 1911 Chinese Cookery in the Home Kitchen by Jesse Norton. Okay, and Chinese Americans, they were quite aware of the fact that the conventions of cookbook writing the model for those came from Anglo-Americans, because they knew that when ancient Chinese wrote a cookbook, right? They didn't care much about measurements. Okay, they just say use a little bit of salt, right? A little bit of ginger, whatever that means. Oops. Okay. Most important and most interesting of all is the role that Chinese American cookbook writers played in defining and articulating Chinese cuisine. Okay. Earlier we said Chinese American cookbook writers, can be regarded as culinary ambassadors, because they played the role of introducing a new, totally exotic, right, unlikable and often despised cuisine to American culture. So they had that role of cultural ambassador to play. Okay, but at the same time, they were not simply just translating one cuisine to another culture or introducing another one cuisine to another culture. Right? They were doing more than that. In fact, none of the cookbooks published from 1911 to 1985 was a direct translation from Chinese. Right? So doing more than that. What they were doing basically was to define and articulate what Chinese food really was. In other words, let me make a bold statement, which is quite true. The articulation and definition of Chinese cuisine happened more in the U.S. than it did in China. It's because of the fact that Chinese Americans, they had to talk to non-Chinese, to Anglo mainstream audiences. Okay, so here are some examples of what they did to define and articulate what Chinese food means. Okay. Oops. In writing Chinese food cookbooks, Chinese Americans were not just simply writing about food, right? They were also writing about their culture, their sense of identity, their family, and their community. Okay, this is because cookbook writing provided the most important, the most visible, the most stable and constant platform for Chinese Americans to speak to non-Chinese audiences. They never had such a platform before. Okay, and in this platform, in other words, in writing about Chinese food, they spoke very loudly, and they spoke not as marginalized, victimized minorities. Rather, they spoke as authorities, as teachers, as experts. Okay, so those, and they spoke about Chinese traditions, and they constantly invoked historical figures like Confucius. Okay, and what is also interesting is that they spoke about Chinese culture and Chinese food with a lot of pride. We have to remember that until the first half of the 20th century, Americans basically despised, hated Chinese food. Okay, but they now spoke of Chinese food with a lot of pride, and they spoke of it as a form of art, and a word that was first used by a Chinese American author in the 1930s, and then was adopted by many others. Right. So here, an example from 1955. Okay. So cookbook writing also became a very important vehicle of self-expression. Many American scholars have recognized this, right? People have said, no, this is one of the most important vehicles for women in particular, right? To empower themselves, to articulate themselves, to share the experiences with others. And similarly for Chinese American women who wrote Chinese food cookbooks, this is exactly what they did, right? So one of the most famous cookbook writers, Bu Wei Yang Chao, in her 1945 cookbook, which became very popular and got reprinted several times. In that book, she talked about the writing. Well, first of all, she talked about her experiences growing up in Asia, and then she talked about the writing of the cookbook as a family experience, the role of her daughter, her husband, and so on and so forth. And several people have talked about such experiences like that. And finally, this is also an affirmation of cultural identity, right? Chinese Americans face a lot of discrimination, right? White Europeans, can be assimilated, right? That was not even an option for the Chinese. I once told a group of people in the beginning of a talk, I said, I'm Italian, and people started to laugh, right? We cannot become white, even if we wanted to, as Chinese. Okay, so, but now in cookbook writing, they affirmed with much pride of their cultural identity. I want to quote from a 1976 cookbook by a cookbook author from Hawaii. She said, in the acknowledgments of the cookbook, to the people and the culture of China, I acknowledge my enduring indebtedness. Now, then she continues, as you can see on the board, the collective experience of my people has been my teacher and my benefactor. Okay. So that brings me to the conclusion of the talk. Right? Chinese food cookbooks embodied a desire and attempt of Chinese Americans to search for and to create a space that they could call home in America. And remember, this is a home that is not simply a replica of the homeland, so to speak. From the roles they played in defining and articulating Chinese food, we can see very, very clearly that the home they wanted to create, okay, is something more exciting, more complex, and more intriguing. Thank you very much for your attention.
So, yeah, the lights, someplace. Okay, thank you for all 4 papers. I think what I'd like to do is just take a minute to just make one point, and perhaps this is something that all 4 speakers could respond to, and then turn it over to the audience. So I want to actually piggyback on something that, in fact, was like pretty much the last statement in Young Chen's comment, or his paper, where he referred to this sort of new place and new options as, quote, more exciting. I got you right, correct? Yes, okay, so this whole panel has been based around the idea of longing, disorientation, a sense of, I think we've had the phrase mourning, loss, alienation, stress. How about can you turn this on its head, and to what degree did migration for the groups you studied offer the possibility of more exciting? That is, the possibility of innovation, of engagement with novelty, perhaps even a little bit of liberation from home. Okay, and
I can start.
Okay.
I think, the development of Italian-American food actually is the result of these dynamics. The fact that there were huge meatballs on spaghetti, that was a celebration. I mean, people didn't eat meat in Italy. We didn't eat meat until the 60s, frankly. So coming here and having meat available, accessible, and cheap, well, that was something to celebrate. And we do have meatballs on pasta, but they are this small. And there's, a few in the sauce. And here they became, sort of the kings of the dish. That is a celebration. And at the same time, dishes that were only for special occasions became more daily dishes, and they became the centerpieces in menu. So definitely there is this aspect, at least in the Italian-American experience, of we made it. We can eat meat, we can eat a lot, and we can eat whenever we want. That was a big change for for many, many people.
Okay, great. Jeff?
I think the abundance is certainly there for the Mexican case, but also thinking about liberation and think about the chili queens. And so, on the one hand, we could see this as being sexualized and turned into an object. But on the other hand, I mean, here they were, the center of attention in a way that, in a patriarchal society would not have been possible. And so I think the opportunities for becoming something that is modern, is self-actualization, is really an important part of the story.
Yeah, I would say that if I think about roti and roti skins, one of the things that occurred in the history of the migrant community coming to North America was that initially when people wanted their roti skins, they had to make them themselves. So it would be a real process that you'd have to get there and grind the chickpeas, and you'd have to do it all yourself. And what's happened in the last, I would say, 10 years is we've had a real marketing of people doing this for you. And so a lot of people now will just run down and order skins and then put the filler in themselves at home. And so I think that's been a real change in the way in which people have actually been able to consume this particular item like roti.
I'm glad you asked that question. Similar to what Jeff was saying earlier, Chinese American women they represented a majority of Chinese food cookbooks published in the US. And as women, they faced double oppression in the US. First in the larger society, right? But then within the community, they were not even allowed to go to a restaurant, right? So writing a cookbook became a very liberating experience, as you could easily imagine.
Okay, terrific. Okay, I think that this is your time now, and so are there microphones set up on either side? And so please feel free to come forward and ask questions either to any one speaker, or you can certainly articulate a question that all four could comment upon. So, sir?
Dwayne, I'm from the Caribbean.
Okay.
And I traveled to the Caribbean when I was very young. And I visited Trinidad when I was very young.
Could you speak a little louder? I'm sorry.
And I was in Trinidad when I was very young. The word roti, doesn't it come from the Hindu? What is the origin of that, all the ingredients and all that? Because in Mexico, sure, you have that from the Indians and all this stuff, indigenous community. But in Trinidad, you have, because this is very much close to Tobago, which is another chunk of the island, like in Santo Domingo and Haiti. What is the relationship of the origin of the roti, really? Because the ingredients are very delicious.
Sure.
And when they put them together, spice-wise, is delicious.
Okay.
It's a dream.
I'm glad you're sold on it. Stocks to sell you. My understanding in doing the research for this paper and also familial passing down of this knowledge, it's clearly from India, the roti, and it's clearly hybridized in the Caribbean based on what ingredients were available at the time for people to use to actually create what we've created in Trinidad, in Guyana, somewhat in Jamaica. So these are three sites where you find an Indo-Caribbean population, and given their limitations, what they came up with was what you are probably eating right here in the roti shops in Flatbush. But if you go to an authentic, I hate to use the word authentic, but an Indian restaurant here in New York also, a South Asian Indian restaurant, they'll actually have something called roti also, but it will not look and or taste like a roti you have from Trinidad. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes.
Okay. My name is Vicky Yu. I'm a master's student in the gastronomy program at BU. This is for Yong. You talked about how the cookbooks that were written from 1911 to 1985 were primarily targeted towards non-Chinese clientele. Right. I was curious about basically why. Was it an expectation that, for example, specifically geared towards American-born Chinese Americans? Was it because there was an expectation that they would learn it from home, or why is that?
And thank you for that question. because it allows me to go back to a point that I missed to mention. It was because the Chinese community was small, and it was because the Chinese community was primarily immigrant, non-English reading immigrant. And it was so small that in the 1930s, the whole community was under 80,000 people. 80,000 people. And it's that tiny little community that carried Chinese restaurants to the entire United States. An incredible story. Without the backing of corporations, government power, advertising, and so on and so forth. 80,000 people. Thank you.
Sir, I don't think anybody can hear you, so maybe if you have a specific question to come to the microphone, and then very quickly.
When that came?
It's everywhere. The founder of the Republic of China said as early as 1918, the founder of the Republic of China, right, 1918, he said, you cannot go to a city in the US without seeing a Chinese restaurant. So not just New York or San Francisco.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Arabi, and I'm a student at CUNY. My question's for Dwayne. Have you begun to analyze the results of your study in regards to people of different nationalities from the Caribbean and how they feel about Trinidadian food? And also, are you going to take that further? I know, like here in New York and Crown Heights and Flatbush, everyone from the Caribbean lives alongside each other, and some of those emotions might be felt, you know, at different restaurants, if it's not necessarily their own home cooking.
Thanks for the suggestion. We have not. We only started the research in October of 2012. Yeah, so we're just starting to, and you know, we finally closed the survey off in January, and then we started doing the analysis. So we will get there, I think, because we have a really nice sample, and I think we have a population. We probably want to up our population of others, obviously, to figure out whether they also have those same desires. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Eric Castellanos. I'm a professor of anthropology at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Just one comment, the sort of inverse relationship in terms of the sale of cookbooks and the amount of people who are cooking, it's not quite as illogical because people just don't know how to cook, so they have to have that reference as well. But one thing that strikes me, and I'm sure that the papers address this more in detail, is that immigrant populations are often treated as sort of homogenous entities, and that there's a lot of internal difference as well. And I think sometimes that's teased out in terms of what is cooked, how it's cooked, et cetera. And in some cases, the migration process helps bring them together, but in some cases it also accentuates those differences. And I'm also thinking, in particular in the Mexican community, Mexican tradition, there's a quite big difference in terms of sophisticated cocina and the street food that people consume. And sometimes there's a return to the street food, a romanticization of the street food, but also in particular in Mexico, sort of the movement away from the classical European-focused kitchen to re-embrace the indigenous kitchen. Could you, all of you, speak maybe to those differences? And one last just comment. I find it interesting that Fabio's experience, many of my students who go to Italy looking for authentic Italian cuisine, especially when they go to Rome, find themselves with dishes with things that they particularly don't find that appetizing, in particular offal in their foods. So.
Okay, so that's something I think that all four panelists could address, but Jeff, do you want to begin?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, those are very important points, and certainly enormous differences region and class in Mexico that then kind of becomes bumped up together. And I think in some ways that can be a form of nationalizing of, you know, sort of making and learning what is Mexican abroad through sort of a nostalgic view. And I think that indigenous is precisely that nostalgic thing. And without going too deeply into this, in Mexico there is a trend to look at the indigenous population as being romanticized and sort of seen as being the symbol of national identity, but actually living Mexican. So ancient Aztecs and Mayans are seen as being, kind of providing legitimacy to the Mexican nation, but living Indians are seen as being somebody if you're decent people, you don't want to be. And so there's this real divide within what's often called Creole, right? European origin Mexican nationalism. And I see some real parallels between the Creole nationalism that actually created an independent Mexico and some of these chefs today who are practicing this upscale cuisine, sort of using that. The Nueva Cocina uses the sort of images of the Maya to sort of make it authentic, while making it very clear that they're distancing it from those street foods, tacos, and whatnot. So yeah, there's a very complicated dynamics going on within those communities, and thanks for bringing that up.
Fabio?
In the Italian American community, that's a very important dynamic. Italians started coming to the US at the end of the 19th century when Italy had just been made as a country. Italy was officially launched in 1861, but the unification process lasted until 1918. So when people came here, of course, it was not the poorest people who came here, because otherwise they couldn't have afforded the boat. But they were new to the idea of being part of a country. They spoke different dialects, and they came from territories that, until a few years before, belonged to different countries. So now they found themselves living in close quarters, speaking different dialects, cooking very different foods, but being perceived very often by the host community as one entity. So in a way, I think the pressure coming from the outside also really forced them to negotiate their differences and create a sort of shared identity that was Italian. And I think this is the difference, the reasons why Italian food and Italian American food developed so differently from the same root, because they responded to different, internal dynamics, but also external pressures. So in Italy in the 20s, we had, fascism and all the discourse, the ideological discourse about food that Mussolini adopted, while here, Italian Americans were negotiating their position as Italians and also as non-black, because as you know, at the beginning, many people were not sure if Italians were actually white. So it became an important pressure element in creating an identity that they could present and they could live with. And so you see at that point the emergence of cookbooks that sort of created the common language that in Italy, back home, was being created, but in a completely different way. And so after 100 years, the two cuisines were clearly related, but also quite different.
I would like to think about the idea of doubles. And you saw in the mashup video clip, which we used for this presentation, that actually showed you how doubles are made. And that's actually authentic doubles. That is, in Trinidad, authentic doubles, you buy them on the streets. It's a vendor. It's never in a store. And the interesting part is when somebody arrives here, that's not a space that they can actually occupy. We can't have food vendors that are selling that on the streets. So the doubles have actually migrated, in a sense, into roti shops. I find that very interesting because in Trinidad itself, people actually would only consume doubles on the streets. That's where the authentic space is. And so people would never imagine going into a roti shop in Trinidad and ordering doubles. It's not authentic. It's not the same thing. So I think that's a major change that takes place in terms of migration. It actually moves from a street food to an indoor food.
My Jewish friend once told me that one way to find a Jewish community is to count the number of Chinese restaurants. This is about the long-time connection between Jews and Chinese food. So after Nixon's visit to China in 1972, many Jews became very excited. Now, they used to, every Jewish neighborhood has at least one Chinese restaurant, right? So they used to go to Chinatown for authentic Chinese food. Now when China opened up, So a lot of them went to China to serve in search of authentic Chinese food. One Jewish woman brought with her a copy of a menu from her favorite restaurant in Manhattan, right? And then she gave that menu to her guide in Beijing, and the guy could not find more than 3 items throughout Beijing, and she was so disappointed because the Chinese restaurants that were established in the U.S. until the 1970s were almost exclusively Cantonese.
Okay, yes. Okay, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Gross. I'm actually the founder of a new social enterprise in New York City called the League of Kitchens, and we're working with immigrants who are really passionate home cooks to teach small cooking workshops in their homes. So this is very connected to what you guys are talking about, but my mother is a Korean immigrant. My father is a New Yorker of Hungarian Jewish descent. And so on one side, I'm the daughter of an immigrant, and I grew up living with my Korean grandmother who cooked Korean food in our home. But one thing I've noticed in my own experience and in the experience of friends who are also the children of immigrants and who are assimilated professionals in the United States is that food is one of the main ways they connect with their heritage or immigrant culture, but part of this assimilation, professionalization process has been losing the ability to cook that food. Because I can say from my own experience, my Korean grandmother was always shooing me out of the kitchen and saying, just go study, don't worry about cooking, you don't have to do this. And she said the same thing to my mother, actually, so neither of us can cook Korean food, which is one of the reasons that I'm starting this new company. But I'm wondering if any of you have done research on this sort of kind of dynamic or have any thoughts about that.
Well, before anybody on the panel answers your question, I have a question for you, which is who takes the courses? Sure. That is, that is, you have these cooking classes in immigrant homes. Okay, so are the students who come to take these classes, and I hate this word group because it assumes a kind of actual corporate identity, but are they individuals of that background, or are they from other backgrounds fascinated with the novelty and with and who want to extend their own repertoire of what they know how to cook?
Well, actually, we're launching public workshops in the fall. So right now, we're in the process of hiring and training instructors and putting together the curricula and sort of building the structure first. But based on who I've been talking with, I think there's going to be some of both. I think this is going to be popular among people who want to learn how to cook different cuisines from other countries but find it intimidating, but are interested in culture and interested in learning techniques and recipes from a person as opposed to a book, and from someone who learned it from their families. And but also, I have spoken with children of immigrants who want to learn how to cook the cuisine of their own culture, you know, who haven't had a chance to do that, and their families maybe across the country or somewhere else.
Okay, fascinating. Yes, please. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say there's at least, it seems to me, 2 things going on here. One is the social mobility that we've seen earlier, really throughout this, is the desire, you know, for immigrants to see their children do better, right? So become professional and you know, not be stuck at home. But then also, you know, grandma is kind of protecting her turf, you know? If you don't need her for the kimchi or whatever it is, you know, you'll probably wander off. So, you know, she's making sure that there's that link still, that family power.
Okay, anybody else want? Oh, yes.
I also think there might be different reactions depending on which generation. Some people might resent the fact that they have to go to these family meals where always the same food is prepared by grandmother in the same way, and they might want to do something else. But maybe their children might become nostalgic and want to go back and cook. So there's also that diachronic aspect of these dynamics.
And in the Trinidad context, my experience has been the Naparima Girls cookbook, if anybody actually knows that cookbook. It's one that's produced in Trinidad. It's been produced for about 50 years or so. And it's the same cookbook that's been passed down from generations. So I'm referring to myself now. When I moved out to Oregon 19 years ago, my mother handed me a copy and said, this is what you need to use. And what I've done is, because I remember all the smells of the kitchen, because I grew up in the household, I knew what the foods are supposed to taste like and what they're supposed to look like. So when I go through the cookbook, it's actually very easy to put the recipes together and actually make it. But the 10th time you finally get it, but you go along.
There's actually historical and statistical evidence that the third generation often, not always, often come back to the cooking of the grandparents. So they may be your target audience.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
It's actually really remarkable that she asked that question because it's very similar to mine. And I've had the same experience, but as a teacher, I work with kids. We recently did a food blogging project where we had a whole class full of kids working on food blogs, and we allowed them to choose their own topics. And it's interesting because your work represents, I think, kind of the major areas that kids are really excited about today. Like, we basically grouped them into kids who wanted to study Italian food, kids who wanted to study tacos, kids who wanted to study traditional Caribbean foods that they ate at home, and then Chinese food. And it's funny because the kids who ate Caribbean food really just wanted to study Caribbean food, but the other kids didn't necessarily have to be Chinese or Italian or Mexican to be interested in researching those foods, because I think that they've probably just been exposed to them maybe over a longer period of time. I think it's a bit harder in Brooklyn to find a roti shop, but there's a lot of Chinese restaurants. So, but I experienced the same thing in that with the kids that were trying to extract recipes out of their own families versus kids that went to the internet to put together recipes that their mothers had no clue how to make, the kids who were trying to extract recipes from their grandmothers had a tougher time of it because the information on the internet wasn't there necessarily for the things that their grandmothers made, and their grandmothers were really sometimes reticent about giving them the recipes. And one girl who was studying roti said that her grandmother told her that it would be disrespectful. What you're asking is disrespectful. And so on the one hand, it was an amazing project because the kids were so excited to express themselves, as you said, or to reconnect with something that they had lost. And so I guess my question to you is, where do you feel like the next generation is at in terms of passing this knowledge on to their kids, like kids who are kids right now? How do you think that information is getting passed or is going to be passed based on the media that we now have available? I don't know if any of you have touched on that.
I've been working with a few organizations that use food to develop intercultural communication skills among children in the same class. And one particular experiment struck me. They organized a little market where each child had to present to the other some food of his or her own community. And it was a very tactile experience. It was very simple. It was the children explaining to other children what the food was. But what it was interesting, apparently the parents participated and started talking also about their food. So maybe it could happen then, as also Yon Cheng was saying, the newer generation might be more interested and might suck their parents into some sort of conversation about that. At least that was the experience that these people had with the class market.
That's such a good idea. We had a potluck and it was very popular with parents. Like, the key to parental engagement turns out to be macaroni and cheese. So that was, a market is actually a way cooler idea. So what are the organizations, if you don't mind me asking?
I remember the name of the person, Lynn Frederick, and the organization is, I can't remember. Food Cook Productions. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Family Cook Production.
Family Cook Productions.
Sometimes they're very direct, but I think often they're mediated. People are watching TV to see what those things are.
Right. And I was really surprised when you said that the students couldn't find it on the internet, because if I wanted to find a roti recipe, you can go on the internet and find it really, really, really quickly. Not to say it's a good one, but it's not as good as grandma.
We eventually tracked it down.
Yeah. And so the second generation and third generation, I think, are really going to be relying on obviously asking first, but if they don't get a response, I think they're going to go to their Google search and hunt it down very, very quickly. But I also think they may not even attempt it because a roti skin now is $1.50 to $2 per skin, and the amount of time it takes you to get all the things together and grind it by, if you were doing it authentically by hand and all the rest of it, it's just not worth it. It's easier to buy it.
Yeah.
Regarding the preservation of traditional foods, let me be very blunt. I see no hope with regards to Chinese Americans, the second generation. This is actually a more complex statement than it seems. But one simple reason is that the second generation overall is losing, first of all, the language. As fast as the Italians used to do in the 1960s. So that's happening to Chinese Americans. And in terms of food, it's also happening, like what's happening in the area of language. So, but that may not be necessarily a bad thing because food in China itself is changing, right? So what is Chinese food? We come back to that question again.
Did you have a question? Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Lauren Cutright-Cisneros. I'm an AmeriCorps Vista member with the New York City Coalition Against Hunger. And yesterday when we were discussing migration, it was a lot of forced migration. We were discussing reasons that people are forced to emigrate to other countries for better lives. And one of the things we've been talking about today, a reoccurring theme, is how often the identity of the home is complex and it is continuously changing in diaspora. And so even among friends who went to study abroad in college to places where their parents grew up. I had an Italian friend who's Sicilian, trilingual because he speaks his dialect, formal Italian and English, got to Sicily, was like, I don't know what to eat because nothing is actually like what my parents have raised me on, even though they told me it was traditional. And he was just very, very confused and unhappy. So I'm wondering, if you are coming from somewhere else, let's say South America, and you arrive here, and then all of a sudden we have tacos, and we have all these things that are actually from Lebanon, and I don't know how many of you learned that today for the first time, but I did. I was like, Lebanon. I'm just, how much harder is it going to be for people who are coming here as forced migration to look for these things that remind them of home and not necessarily, like, they're not going to be making the roti anymore, they're going to be buying the skins, or they're going to be finding it in restaurants, and things like that. Recreating home is now harder, maybe, because of the complex nature of diaspora and how things are changing. Just if anybody has something to say on that.
Okay, I was going to say that making of home then becomes almost symbolic in the sense, and people figure out symbolic moments throughout the week or throughout the year that they'll celebrate and become Trinidadian or Guyanese or Jamaican. For example, the Labor Day Parade. Everyone wants to be Trinidadian that day. You go on and you find other moments that are happening, and you want to be Jamaican another day because there's a big, Jamaican star coming in town. So I think that's what the second generation typically will do more of than the first generation. That is cross boundaries of ethnicity, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, Guyanese, crossing different boundaries. But interestingly enough, even when they're crossing boundaries, they oftentimes also carry around symbols of where they've actually come from. So even if they're at an event that involves across the boundary Caribbean folks, like let's say the Labor Day Carnival, many of them will also be carrying around little flags or wearing a T-shirt or putting on something that has a flag or that tells you where they've actually come from. Even if they're second generation, even if they're third generation, they may not have ever been born there, they've only ever made visits, they still want you to know authentically, I'm Haitian, although I'm celebrating in a Trinidadian space.
It depends on what you mean by home, right? So oftentimes we associate the notion of home with a physical space, right? After living in the U.S. for 13 years, I went home for the first time, my homeland, China. But I went to China to realize that I could not go home in China because the land had been changed so dramatically in so many ways beyond my recognition.
Yes, please.
So this question is for Jeffrey Pilcher. My name is Lucia, and I'm a master's candidate for the BU Gastronomy program. You touched very briefly about Korean tacos, and it's such an interesting phenomenon that tacos could be considered an American vehicle for other ethnic food. And so my question, it's kind of a fun question, to what extent would you consider Korean tacos or any other ethnic taco that is not associated with Mexican food as a part of Mexican foodways, not necessarily to the extent of Mexicans eating Korean tacos, but because of the use of an ingredient. And this is a question for everyone. What are your thoughts of viewing food as a mutable object, kind of the material culture approach to studying ethnic foodways?
That's a really good question. And one of the questions, is really why do we insist on assigning nationality too? So one of the things I found was that Mexicans oftentimes rejected Mexican American foods as not being really Mexican. And so clearly they're not going to be happy with a with a Korean version. Although, maybe if what was the guy's name? The Korean taco guy in L.A. If he'd landed in Mexico City, that probably would have been cool. So I think the nationality really makes very peculiar sort of sentiments with regards to food, very complicated ones. And then the material culture is so fascinating because, of course, you find actually tacos and tamales all over the world in the sense that, a taco is a flatbread with, stuff in it. And obviously, as we've seen just on this panel, there's flatbreads all over the place, or other things you can wrap things in like lettuce. And tamales, right? You wrap something up and steam it. And so, these are common cooking practices, independent invention that go back, thousands of years. And so looking at the material culture, in parallel to the identities that we assign to these foods, very interesting, juxtapositions start popping up. So I think that's a really interesting research approach that could yield all kinds of fun stuff.
Fabio?
And actually there is, the whole approach of the social life of things, that it's extremely useful and it's been widely used to analyze how the same object can have different lives depending on the context, and it can participate in different processes of identification, of cultural reproduction, even if the object is exactly the same. There's been research about specific kinds of peppers, about sauces, about pasta. So actually the material part of the research can be interpreted in this way. So how come the same object can be interpreted in many different ways? That's why I like to talk of food also in terms of text, communication, sort of cultural coherence, because suddenly it becomes part of a new system of communication. So of course it means new and different things.
My comment is going to be comparing, let's say, Jamaican and Trinidadian and Guyanese cultures, because they're probably the biggest groups here in New York, and also of course Haitians. But I won't talk about Haitians because I don't know very much about their cultural practices. Now, for those three I just mentioned, something like, let's say, ackee and saltfish, or something like oxtail or curry goat. These are very Jamaican accented dishes. Trinidadians may, for instance, try those, but they would not necessarily want them or desire them, which I find very interesting. Somebody like myself, who has lived in those various spaces, I'm okay with all those foods. But what I find is there's an ethnic division within the Caribbean, based on island, that people have certain preferences for certain dishes that come from their island or territory. For Guyana, for example, it's something called pepper pot, if anybody know about that one. That's definitely a Guyanese dish. No one else tries to make it. It's their thing. And there are some that actually cross boundaries, and that's where I would suggest that roti is one of those that crosses the boundaries of all of those cultures. But some remain where they are.
Your good question reminds me of two stories. The first one has to do with the ownership of a cuisine or a food item. The second one has to do with what we might call cultural imperialism, right? In the first case, first case, I was thinking of the battle between Japan and South Korea over the ownership of kimchi, because kimchi has become $1 billion business globally, and Japanese companies are doing very well. often claiming this is Japanese. So now many Koreans became very upset. So it's a long-lasting battle, legal, cultural, political, over the ownership of kimchi. And in this case, we see the desire to want to claim ownership, right? In another case, we see the work of cultural imperialism, right? That's seen in the effort by several years ago, the first attempt by Taco Bell to go to Mexico, right? Which failed miserably, and then tried again. Yeah, Jeffrey knows a lot more about this than I do. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, so here are 2 people lined up.
I'm Caitlin, and I'm doing my undergrad in global studies, and I'm doing my thesis on low-income foodways and their links to diet-related diseases and obesity. And just this whole notion of like longing and missing and kind of this like mourning kind of links to, as Professor Pilcher was saying, the transplantation and also acculturation, which is kind of used as a justification oftentimes as to why immigrants undergo or experience like weight gain and health changes upon moving to the U.S. And I know that in New York City, Mexican immigrants yield significantly higher rates of obesity and diet-related diseases than Chinese immigrants, let's say. Excuse me. So I don't know if like any of your research or in your experiences you've come across this, but why do you think there is such a disparity between these rates in these 2 ethnic groups?
Well, in the case of Mexican immigrants, we should keep in mind that Mexico has like the 2nd highest level of obesity and diabetes in Mexico. So it's not that they kind of come here, get disoriented, and start eating junk food. They're eating junk food back in Mexico. And so I think that we need to, clearly look at the situation, but I don't think we should sort of blame it on problems of migration and diaspora.
Okay, there was one more. Yes. Or just, I'm sorry, please.
To add to what Jeffrey was saying, in the U.S., some people have pointed out that there are food deserts, right? Where African Americans, Mexicans, they don't get enough nutritious food restaurants, don't have enough choices, don't have enough high enough income to afford to have choices. Yeah.
I'll give the example of Indo-Caribbean men in particular, and Indo-Caribbeans in general. They arrived in situations like North America where they actually now had access to lots and lots of meat and lots of fatty foods, which did not exist in the diet if you go back historically into Trinidad and or Guyana. And so what you start seeing happening for Indo-Caribbean men in particular is they find very high rates of heart disease and very, very high rates of cholesterol. And so what you see, in my opinion, again, I'm not an epidemiologist or anything like that, but I think there's a real correlation between migration, lifestyle, and changes in diet, primarily because of increasing socioeconomic status and giving you access to more foods that you possibly wouldn't have had in the same volume back in the home country. You may be eating the same foods back there, but not necessarily in the same volume.
Did you want to? Okay, please.
Thank you. My name is Rebecca Feinberg. I'm a PhD student in cultural anthropology at UC Santa Cruz. And now that we've thought so thoroughly about how immigrant groups value their own foods, I'm curious about how these foods that often, when they arrived here, were perceived as dirty or dangerous or even disgusting, have become some of our favorite parts of American life. And yes. So I'm curious, each of you has a different story and a different group, but for your specific study, what groups of consumers or modes of presentation of this food or contexts of consumption do you see as the most important in that valorization process, in that transformation from disgusting to delicious?
I think if we have 2 or 3 hours, we could deal with that, but perhaps each person could give a quick take on that.
I think that really depends on places and periods in time. If for Italians it was the teens, the 20s, where they started opening restaurants, that were boarding houses, they started cooking for other people, and here in the village they became sort of the dingy place where artists could hang out, eat cheap food, and drink wine. And so you had this connection between, sort of bohem life, the village, and Italian restaurants. But for instance, I don't know what the dynamic might have been in Kansas City. So I think it really depends on the situation and when we are looking. It's difficult to make generalization on that.
Certainly the Bohemians are important, but another aspect to this is one that Donna Gabacha talks about in her book, We Are What We Eat, where she emphasizes sort of cross-ethnic eating, particularly among working class peoples. And so in the case of Mexicans, it's oftentimes sort of Central European, Eastern European migrants who eat Mexican as children, and then when they grow up, in a sense, essentially sort of become American in some way. They're bringing Mexican, that taste for Mexican food with them into.
I would have to link, if I were to think about the Caribbean food choices here as being more palatable for the dominant group, to tourism. And so what I would suggest is that as tourism roads started increasing between North America and the Caribbean, mainly Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, again, I'm speaking to, I think that had a propensity to then change people's desires. So for example, you go away to Negril Beach and you're having a great time and they serve you jerk chicken and they serve you rice and peas. You get back to New York City and you say, that was pretty good. I'm going to try and check out a restaurant that may exist. And oftentimes Caribbean people who are now becoming entrepreneurial in a sense, so they've settled, they've worked, and they're now determining how do I get into some kind of way of making more money. Oftentimes restaurants are one of the first places they try to branch out and become entrepreneurs through. And hair salons is another one for women. And so these spaces become the attempt by Caribbean migrants to start a business for themselves. But I would suggest that tourism is one. And then of course, having neighbors. And what I mean by that is that once Caribbean people started buying up houses and becoming your neighbor in a sense, and their children start playing with your children, and they may go over to the person's house and actually start tasting certain types of foods. And as that generation became older, they started naturalizing it.
That's a great question from UC comrade. It's so great that it actually took me 300 pages to answer, to investigate seriously, because what Chinese food throughout the much of the 19th century and then many years in the first half of the 20th century was one of the most despised, if not the most despised cuisine in America. Okay, so much evidence about that. Yeah, but then it became also the single most popular ethnic cuisine in America. There's statistical evidence of that as of 1989. Okay, so how did that happen? So I wrote 300 pages to answer that question. So please wait until the book comes out. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have time for one more one-minute question.
Because I'm Debbie Su. I'm from University of Florida, and then my question is because I'm Chinese here living in the United States, and I have been searching for the authentic Chinese, and then because all you guys touch some aspects of authenticity, I just wondering what aspects of authenticity are you guys talking about? Because as I know authenticity, there is no scholarship, definition of that. And then once said that there are 3 types of authenticity. One is the object-related authenticity. The second one is the subjective, because I say it's authentic, it's from someone who is maybe Chinese and say, oh, it's authentic, and then I believe it's authentic. This is the subjective authenticity. The third one is the existential authenticity. Maybe people who want to eat the Korean taco because they don't care about the authenticity of the taco or the Korean. They just want the new experience, want something really different, and then feel the different aspect of myself. And I just wonder, you guys, the study of you guys did is what aspect of authenticity are you guys, talking about? Or, this is my question.
I'm not sure you can be so precise in dividing those authenticities. As I said, it's in a way contextual, but what's important in the authenticity is not so much the validity compared to a reality, but the personal experience and the connection in a way that makes it relevant. I mean, when I speak with Italian Americans and I tell them, well, we actually don't have the 7-fish dinner for Christmas, they're not happy. And I'm not saying, your food is not authentic. So these are very important things from the point of view of the emotional investment that we put into it. And then at a larger cultural level, why is authenticity, besides the fact, that you might come from China and you would like to eat exactly the same thing what you ate of China. But why on newspapers, TV shows, on blogs, there is this search of authenticity that in a way it's also connected with authority. Because you come from there and you're just saying, I want to eat what I was used to eat before. But if you're claiming the authenticity of a food, in a way, you get, you put yourself in the position of authority to say, I know what that food is. So at times it can be complicated depending on who does this sort of claims.
As a historian, I've tried to historicize authenticity. So in my book, Planet Taco, I say, well, what was authentic? What was real Mexican food 100 or 200 years ago? And so looking at it historically, I think, can be one interesting approach.
Dwayne?
In the Caribbean community, again, I'm just talking about the three groups again. I think authenticity typically is going to be mom's kitchen or grandma's kitchen. That's where the baseline is. However, if you leave that baseline and you go into spaces like New York, I think authenticity then ranges from places like going to Flatbush, Queens, versus going to Lower Manhattan and having Caribbean food there. And I say that because if you have been to Lower Manhattan, you realize, yes, there are Caribbean cuisine there, but it's oftentimes 10 times the price, and it's often seen as that's the place that white American folks will go. Caribbean folks will typically go down to those other spaces to be authentic. And then if you travel back to the islands themselves, or the actual locations, there's different authenticities even there, because you've got, let's say, Port of Spain versus San Fernando authenticities, that's south versus the north, and then you have rural versus urban. So there's a lot of different authenticities that people will measure how good that actually tastes, and what kind of authenticities that people are looking for.
About one sentence response to a profound question. It's based on my 25-year search for authentic Chinese food. It is to be found in your heart.
Okay, and I think that's That was a wonderful one-liner to end, and I want to thank all four panelists and the organizers of the conference, and you all for being such an actively engaged audience. Thank you.
So we'll reconvene here at 6 for a panel of writers that have used food in their creative writing. This is a part of the program that we've started with the writing program here at the New School. And just a plug for our blog, The Inquisitive Eater. It's a food journal. Everybody can submit, and actually we would love to get submissions from all of you. We accept anything from pictures to design to poetry to fiction to nonfiction. It's theinquisitiveeater.com. And the link for the submission is very easy. Thank you. And see you at 6 here.
It was lovely.